Random thoughts here. Today we are going to talk about the origin of Swahili or Kiswahili. Now, Swahili language is spoken widely in East Africa or the Eastern African region. It is the official language in Tanzania, Kenya, and Uganda, and it's also widely spoken in Rwanda, Burundi, Eastern DRC, Mozambique, and it's also spoken in the Comoros Islands. As in fact, we can say an official language, even though that Swahili is a little bit different, but it's basically Swahili anyways. And also Swahili is now being taught in schools in South Africa, in Botswana, Namibia, South Sudan, Ethiopia. So these countries are making steps towards making Swahili a language that is spoken within their borders. So they are including it in the syllabus that is taught in schools. In total, Swahili is spoken by over 200 million people in Eastern African region. And also Swahili is the official language of several major organizations. The EAC, East African Community, of course, Swahili is going to be a major language and it's going to be an official language, or it is an official language for that body. Another regional body that uses Swahili as an official language is SADC. This is the body that brings together the countries to the southern part of Africa. And also Swahili is an official language of the AU, the African Union. So Swahili is a language that is expanding in usage and is becoming popular, especially in Africa. And part of that growth is being driven by the desire that Africa should be using native languages when communicating within the continent, rather than using languages that came from Europe that were brought by the colonizers. And so Swahili has become that one of those languages that most people, or most Africans are thinking or are pushing to be a language that is used on the continent more than the European languages. Now, the origin of Swahili is kind of interesting because Swahili itself often is not considered to be a language that has been there forever, or it's a language that has emerged not long ago, but all languages are the same anyway. So this is not unique to Swahili. English is a language that emerged at some point by different languages merging, and then English emerged. Now Swahili, the foundation of Swahili is Bantu. It's a Bantu language. And anybody who speaks Bantu language, any other Bantu language, will find it very easy to understand Swahili and to learn it. You might not have been exposed to Swahili, but if you speak any Bantu language and people start speaking Swahili around you, you will easily pick what they are saying because it's basically at the foundational level, it's a Bantu language. Now, but it's a Bantu language that is a little bit different from other Bantu languages in Africa. Unlike most other Bantu languages on the continent, Swahili has a lot of loanwords from Arabic. Now, all languages have loanwords. This is also, again, not unique to Swahili. Every language, English, French, all languages have loanwords from other languages. That's how languages evolve over time. Swahili has a huge list of words that are borrowed from Arabic. Some studies put it between 15 and 20%. That's the number or the amount of lexicon that comes from Arabic. And we have to point out that it's mostly nouns. It's rarely the structure of the language. The structure of the language is, you can say, almost 100% Bantu, but then it picks this vocabulary for the most part is the vocabulary. It picks the vocabulary from Arabic. And I need to point out that even the name of the language, Swahili or Kiswahili, is an Arabic word, which means the coasts. So because it's a language that was spoken along the coast of East Africa, and it was called the Swahili or Swahili, and that name stuck. Besides Arabic, Swahili, of course, has loanwords from other languages because Swahili has had interactions with many other languages. Remember, the east coast of Africa was, of course, inhabited by the Bantu people, and then the Arabs come, and then the Persians come, and then there's a huge influence, in fact, from the Persian language. In fact, there are groups of people in the east coast of Africa who are the descendants of Persians and Africans and Bantus. In Zanzibar in particular, they are called the Shirazis. Now, of course, that tells you how Persia ended up having a huge influence in East Africa, and part of that influence comes in form of loanwords that come from the Persian language. And then, of course, the East African coast was colonized at some point by the Portuguese. Now, there are also loanwords from the Portuguese that came into Swahili. There are not that many, maybe 1 to 2%, but of course, those words exist. And then, of course, there are other words that came from languages spoken in the Indian subcontinent, from Malaysia. People from these regions were trading with the East African coast, and one of the things they left behind are a few words that became part of the Swahili language. And of course, English has contributed to the vocabulary of Swahili, especially, of course, Kenya, Tanzania, to some extent, have been colonized by the British, and the British left behind a lot of words that now form part of Swahili, but they are originally English words. To some extent, German language has also contributed to some extent what has become the Swahili language, because of course Tanganyika was Tanganyika, which is the larger part of what we know today as Tanzania, was colonized by the Germans. But where did the language itself emerge? This is a question that many people sometimes discuss, especially if you talk to Kenyans and Tanzanians. Of course, Tanzanians will claim Swahili is their language. Of course, they speak more Swahili than Kenyans do, and they try to speak what we can call the more grammatically correct Swahili, even though that is something that is debatable, because Swahili, like any other language, has different accents, and you can't say one accent is the correct and the other one is not actually, but we can say the Tanzanians try to follow very strict rules of the language and Kenyans don't. Now, but then we can say the Kenyans have their own version of Swahili. But where did Swahili itself emerge? Is it Tanzania? Is it Kenya? Is it Mombasa? Is it Zanzibar? Actually, it's very difficult to tell where Swahili emerged first, because there are no actual record to tell us that this is the exact place where Swahili was born. But by looking at the foundational structure of Swahili, especially as a Bantu language, and then going out and looking at other languages, especially Bantu languages that are closely related to Swahili, we can to some extent come up with a picture of what actually happened. Now, Swahili as a Bantu language is closely related to languages that are called the Sabaki group of Bantu languages. And these languages are mostly in Kenya. So a few of them are in Somalia, for example, the Bajuni, Mwini, and then others are in Kenya, Pokomo, Malakote, Mijikenda, and some are in Mozambique, Mwani, and then, of course, the Comorian languages in the Comoros Highlands. Now, I was trying to do some research. It's very hard to come up with a list of similar languages, Bantu languages, especially in the mainland Tanzania, or Tanganyika as used to be called. But I'm thinking there are languages that are closely related to the Sabaki languages that are along the coast of what used to be called Tanganyika. And those languages, of course, had similar structure and vocabulary to the languages that we call today as the Sabaki group of Bantu languages. Now, of course, the beginning of Swahili starts with the arrival of Arabs to the coast of East Africa, and these Arabs, of course, come to do trade. And when they arrive at the coast, of course, not only the Arabs, of course, also the Persians and other peoples, but specifically the Arabs, because they are the largest contributor to what became Swahili outside of the Bantu based language. Now, when these Arabs comes to East Africa, seems like they preferred settling on the islands. They did not like going into the mainland, so they settled on islands like Lamu, Mombasa, Zanzibar, Pemba, and all these Pate, all these islands, and they settle on the islands. But seems like by settling on these islands, of course, they used to have contact with the people on the mainland, and maybe they did find some of these Sabaki Bantu speaking groups on these islands. We never know for sure. I don't think these islands were completely occupied when the Arabs came. Most likely they were occupied, and they found these people who spoke the Sabaki group of Bantu languages. And then they had this interaction, could have been business, trade. Of course, the Arabs came to trade, so of course they were talking to these people. And seems like by speaking, of course, two groups of people meet. You speak your language, you speak our language. We don't have a common language. Of course, we are going to try to find a way to communicate. You speak your language, including some signs. I speak my language with some signs. Over time, I'm understanding a few words of your language, you are understanding a few words of my language. And of course, because the Arabs were among the majority of this Bantu speaking, the Bantu language became more of the language that is spoken more than the Arab language, but the Arabs, of course, contributed the vocabulary. And we can't ignore the influence of religion in all this. Of course, the Arabs were mostly Muslim, and they bring Islam, and Islam is a religion that puts a lot of emphasis on the use of Arabic as the language of the religion to some extent, or to a large extent, we can say. And so this local people, of course, converted to Islam to a large extent, because even today, people along the coast of East Africa, majority Muslim, and because of the classes they had to attend, religious classes, madrasas, and things like that, of course, they had to learn Arabic, and they are learning Arabic, and they are speaking their own Bantu languages, and they are mixing the two, and then this different language sort of emerges. Now, I think Swahili emerged on all these islands, Zanzibar in particular, Pemba, Mombasa, what is called the Mvita, and then Lamu, Pate. All these islands had the same, I'm thinking it was a simultaneous emergence of this unique language. But then these islands, of course, used to do a lot of trading amongst themselves, and the Arabs were basically related, and then there was a lot of movement through the sea, of course, amongst or between these islands. And that way, the language that was emerging was kind of like becoming standardized, even though it never became standardized completely, but it was to some extent, so that somebody speaking the language from Zanzibar will understand somebody speaking the language in Mombasa, and somebody from Mombasa understood somebody speaking the language in Lamu. But the accents were different, and in Swahili, those ones are called lahajas. So there is a lahaja of Amu or Lamu, there is some Vita lahaja or accent, which is Mombasa. Then there is the Unguja, which is mostly Pemba and Zanzibar, and then the islands around it. And of course, there are many other lahajas, many other accents of the Swahili language. And of course, others have emerged. How the people in the mainland Kenya speak Swahili, of course, is a completely different lahaja from the accent you'll hear when you visit Mombasa or the coast of Kenya or Lamu. And how people of the mainland Tanzania speak Swahili is not exactly the same way the people of Zanzibar and Pemba speak Swahili. So there are these different lahajas, but the initial lahajas, of course, came up because the Arabs were interacting with different groups of the Bantu speaking people. So anyways, Swahili emerged in the coast of East Africa, Kenya, Tanzania, maybe even Mozambique, even up to Somalia. We never know for sure, but for sure it's along that coast, and we can't say it was on one particular location, but several locations. Those are my random thoughts.